Does MultiVersus have rollback? No. So, that's not the full story. It depends what you mean by rollback. Some disclaimers first. I'm not going to be giving a complete picture on anything I'm describing. I'm not going to talk about why you would want to run a game on a server, or everything you have to do to stop cheaters from existing. I'm just going to pretend those don't exist, because they're not relevant, although in a real situation, you have to consider these things. Alright, I also have no affiliation with MultiVersus, or any other major games. But, obviously, I have no insider information, so I can just be completely wrong. Like, I can't see the code, I can only determine what is happening from testing. I'm still trying to keep this video accurate, although it's not the full picture, it's just what needs to be known, and I'm trying to make sure that knowledge is correct. First, we need to define these three terms with regards to what they mean in an online match. This local game is the part of an online match that is local to the player's perspective. The remote game is a game that is sending information to the local game over the internet in an online match. A server is a computer that is remote to both players and performs some gameplay related process using the information that the players send it. This is not the standard definition of what a server is. It's useful for my purposes, but servers do a lot more or do a lot less. I'm only talking about the ones that have gameplay related processes. When you play a game online, there's a lag in knowing any information a remote game is sending. The local information is known instantly. What this means is that the game needs some way to determine how it will respond to information that it does not have at the time. The game logic that determines what the correct response is when the information comes in is called the source of truth. In fighting games, a typical way to determine truth is to say that the way the game works offline is the source of truth. That is to say, both local games will agree upon a sequence of events that happened, and then the consequences of those events are true, regardless of the lag. The agreed upon sequence of events is what I would call the true game. For fighting games, this sequence of events is usually a list of inputs with a timestamp attached to them that says when they should be run. As a consequence of using a shared input list as a source of truth, the gameplay logic has to run the same way on every system every time it is run. That is to say, the gameplay logic has to be deterministic. When fighting games are played online, both games usually agree on some starting point. Then they share inputs with each other. That is, both games send their local inputs to the remote player with a timestamp so they know when they are. The inputs that are sent out have a note attached to them that say on what frame they are being done locally, so that the remote game can put them into the input list on the correct frame. This creates a problem though. Due to the fact you can't pause and wait for the remote input every frame, if a game timestamps the local input with the same frame as the frame it was pressed, then by the time it reaches the remote player's game will have already moved past that time. This is where rollback and delay come into play. Delay is the simpler of the two. It fixes the problem of not knowing what the remote input is on the current frame by adding a delay to the local input so that the remote input or a frame should arrive before the local input is needed. That is to say, if the game was on frame 100 and it took 3 frames to travel over the network, then the local game would read an input on frame 100 from the controller, but it schedules the input to play out on frame 105 for 5 frames of delay, which is enough to cover that 3 frames of lag. So on frame 100, when it reads that input from the controller, it'll send it to the remote game and time stamp it for frame 105. That way, when both games reach frame 105, they will have the inputs they need for that frame, because the remote game will have received it on frame 103 in that 3 frames of lag, and then it just waits 2 frames for it to actually put it into the list. And the game, it will run as it would offline at regular speeds if the connection is completely stable. Unfortunately, in real life, connections are very rarely stable. Rollback netcode is best thought of as a fix to delay's inability to handle instability in connections. Rollback netcode makes a prediction about what the remote inputs will be, and then it goes ahead with playing the game. When the remote input comes in, and the predicted input was wrong, the game will quickly go back in time to when the predicted input was wrong, and replay the game with the new corrected input. And this all happens in under a frame, so that the next time it has to put a frame on screen to show the player, it will show the results of the correct inputs. This can look jarring to a player, so rollback netcode will often add in some delay so that it only needs to do a rollback when the connection is unstable. Fortunately, very few inputs will actually cause a visual change, and it is also very simple to predict what the next input will be, because it is very often the same as whatever the last input was. With those two facts, even if you're not adding any delay, a lot of rollbacks won't happen or won't be noticeable, which makes not having enough delay to cover all the network lag not actually matter that much. That's a lot to take in, but essentially, the local game takes a guess at what the remote input will be. If it ends up being wrong, it'll quickly fix it in post and update the visuals, but it's more accurate. When you have enough delay to cover lag, then it works much better because you never actually have to change the amount of delay like you would with delay-based netcode. If the ping jumps for a second or two, you can use rollbacks to cover that time. Then you can go back. And you never needed to change the delay. In both these examples, the way the offline game with the correct inputs work would be considered the true game, and that's the source of truth for any lag-related inconsistency. But what if I told you that a game doesn't need to have a true game in order to have a source of truth? How'd that work? It's pretty simple as a concept, although actually implementing it is not easy. Because you don't actually need to have the games synced up. Think about how rollback works. The games don't actually need to sync up at any point. Every single frame can run an incorrect predicted input, and it will work fine because both games will agree on what the results should be once they get the actual inputs. The important part is that they agree. So what if they came to an agreement by some other set of logic? Well, they can do that. And outside of fighting games, it is often a much better solution than trying to derive the game from the inputs. Imagine if instead of waiting for the remote input, the local game could just tell the remote player what to do. For example, if the remote game said their player did an attack and hit the other player, so the local player was a two-player instance, for 50 damage, then the local game receives that information. It would take 50 health away from the local players and put them into hit stun. It's mostly arbitrary on what is synced and how it is synced. It depends on what the designer wants. You might think that could cause a lot of problems in fighting games, and you would be right, which is why most fighting games don't do that. It does work very well in other games though, especially because you don't need the game to be deterministic. So, for example, if you're playing a card game online, you only really care what card they played. You don't have to sync anything else. You barely even care when they played it. So why bother tracking all their inputs? Just tell them the card to play. So this leads to the next point. Netcode doesn't need to be peer-to-peer. You can have every game report to a server, and the server can be the source of truth. The server does not need to have a true game for the same reasons as before, and how it determines the truth is nearly arbitrary. Because of that, it means that it can have a true game and it could be running delay-based netcode, but instead of having local inputs, it only have remote inputs. The problem is the player with less latency to the server will have less delay, and the only way to fix that is to delay the closer player's inputs. Compared to what the delay would be on a peer-to-peer connection, having a server in the middle with that fix will only be the same or worse. And that's because if a remote player reports to the server and then the server reports to the local player, you're still having the remote player report to the local player, but with an extra step in between, it has to take longer, or at the bare minimum, the same amount of time. What about running rollback on a server? Imagine that the server was running the game with two remote players with the same latency to the server, and it was using rollback netcode. There's two situations here, depending on the implementation. One is that it tells the player what it predicts the game will look like at some point in the future, and the other is that the server tells the player what will happen when it gets their inputs for a frame. So the first way of doing rollback on a server is by predicting what the game will look like in the future. That is to say, having the server predict what the game will look like if it had the local and remote inputs, and sending it out on a time frame so that the predicted frame is received by the players when that frame happens in real time. And this is just horrible for everyone involved. The local inputs are going to have a lot of input delay because they have to go to the server and come back to be reflected on screen. And everything will cause rollbacks. Every input from the local and remote player will cause rollbacks. And that's just extremely disorienting. So nobody ever does this. The other way is a roundabout way to create delay-based netcode essentially. When both players are the same distance away from the server, the local input and the remote input will reach the server at essentially the same time, and you're rarely going to see a rollback. If they are different distances from the server, then the closer player will always see rollbacks and the farther player will never see rollbacks, and you have to add delay to the closer player. That means that you're making the peer-to-peer version of the netcode, but worse, because there's a server in the middle. The upside is that a server will carry computational burden of doing rollbacks, which is a reasonable benefit, especially for large games where rollbacks are taxing or happen very frequently. You can still cause local rollbacks, which are disorienting, and a common network issue, which is an increase of ping from one player to the server, will cause the match to be lopsided in their favor. And the only way to fix that is to change the delay of both players to the server. So like delay-based netcode, you still have to change the delay sometimes. Like delay-based netcode, there are times where you do want to change the delay, which is something rollback is designed to completely remove. So with that out of the way, what does MultiVersus use? The MultiVersus website's FAQ states that MultiVersus has dedicated server-based rollback netcode. Is that true? Well, rollback netcode traditionally uses the offline game as a source of truth, but MultiVersus has glitches that only work online when it is laggy, like this recently fixed glitch. So watch the Bugs Bunny. This glitch alone isn't enough to show that there isn't rollback. It could just be a major bug with the netcode implementation. However, this only worked online and only when it was lagging. So what is the true game in MultiVersus? Traditionally with fighting games, the true game is the one you get from the combined input list that all players agreed upon. But what reasonable inputs result in this next clip? Now I'm fairly certain that those players did not willingly walk off the stage to die at the same time as the lag spike as a coincidence. So clearly the lag spike caused their inputs to change. It is not a shared input list that is agreed upon by all players because the server disagreed with those players' local inputs. The true game is normally time-stamped local inputs, but MultiVersus doesn't simulate an offline game when played online. and the server is the source of truth. Functionally, this does not behave the way rollback does. There are also things like hits being registered well after attacks connect, and teleportations that couldn't be the result of rollbacks. Here's an example of one of the teleportations. There's no set of inputs that sends Wonder Woman there without her being hit again, and you can see the percentage did not change, so she was not hit again. This strongly suggests that MultiVersus is not using rollback, or at a minimum, if it is using rollback, it is not using a true game as the source of truth. It is instead using some other source of truth. Delay-based netcode was designed because syncing inputs was virtually the only reasonable way to have a fighting game translate into online play. Rollback netcode was designed to fix issues that delayed netcode had, while still meeting the requirements that playing a fighting game online demanded. Rollback's sole purpose is to sync inputs without having to change delay, and MultiVersus online doesn't even sync inputs. So, the long answer to if MultiVersus has rollback is, I don't know. But with the way the online works, it'd be useless even if it did. Like, comment, and subscribe.